Hello and welcome to Scientists in Action, the Grandest Canyon and Greatest Mysteries. I'm your host, Kate, from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where you may have guessed it, we are not filming today because instead we are live from the field here at the Grand Canyon. This is by far one of my new favorite places as of perhaps yesterday. I've never been here before. This is really exciting. We cannot wait to share it with all of you. We also have a really cool scientist who is going to share us some amazing information and specimens today. A couple housekeeping items I want to touch on before we get started. If you're going to be our on-camera schools, I'm going to ask that you stay off camera and keep your mics muted until we're ready for your Q&A in about 15 or so minutes. If you're not going to be on camera and you have questions, I love it. We have an open chat, so you can be adding those questions to the chat and we'll make sure our scientist gets them. On that note, I would love to introduce you to Dr. James Hagedorn. He's one of my favorite curators from the museum. He's been a blast to travel with. He has so many cool stories, and I cannot wait to learn more from him today. So, James, tell us about this amazing space and take it away.
Well, great. Well, welcome everyone. And I just want to give a shout out to Kim and Asa and Riley, who are behind the camera and back at the nerve center of the DMNS, helping to bring this amazing place to you. So one of the things that I realized the other day is many people don't know where the Grand Canyon is, and maybe Asa could pull up a map. The Grand Canyon is the biggest hole in North America. It's actually in a national park for the most part, and it's in northern Arizona in the western parts of the United States. And it's a place that you can visit because it belongs to the people. People have been here for millennia, and it's a national park. We're standing right at next to one of the visitor centers here, broadcasting live. But what's so special about the Grand Canyon? One of the things that's amazing about it is that it has billions of years of Earth history recorded in its rocks. It's got a magnificent river like this one on the screen here running down it that supplies ecosystems and people all across the American West. It's been a place of inhabitation and visitation for millennia, and it also has a diverse array of nature and scientific information that's helpful to society. So one of the things about the Grand Canyon that people often wonder is, and we can't quite see it here, is where does all the water come from in this place? I mean, the Grand Canyon is actually in a very dry place. Northern Arizona here is quite dry. It's basically a high desert. But we have one of the biggest rivers in the continent at the bottom of the canyon here. So let's beam over to you and do a poll and try to think about how much water is in the Grand Canyon and where does it come from?
So let's go ahead and poll. This is going to be our poll question number 2, I believe. And we want you to take a guess. Where do you think all the water comes from? We've got quite a number of states on screen. Oh, looks like our poll maybe disappeared. Does the water come from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, or maybe all the above? What do you think? So go ahead and as a class vote. Where do you think all this water comes from?
And while you're thinking about that water, the water is really important because even though this is a very dry place, the water from the Colorado River, as well as the other streams and rivers that feed into it, is what carved the canyon over the last 6 or so million years and reveal the rich story of rocks that's behind us right now.
All right, if you've not already placed your vote, go ahead and put it either in the chat or go ahead and vote on Zoom. But let's go ahead and close that poll. Where does the water come from? All right. Oh, it looks like the great majority say Colorado. We have got 1 vote for Wyoming, none for Utah, Arizona, or New Mexico, and a few for all the above. Where does the water come from?
So it turns out that about 85% of the water does come from Colorado and from Wyoming. But it actually also comes from Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and elsewhere too, because this is a giant river that derive from mountains and rainfall that covers much of the American Southwest. So this river that cuts the canyon here is incredibly long. It goes from Colorado all the way to the Gulf of California. But the Grand Canyon is also really long too. It's huge. And something you may not get a sense for standing here is just how big it is. From where we're standing to the other side of the Grand Canyon, and we can go to the live action camera right now rather than the images, where that place is across the way is called the North Rim. That is, in some places in the canyon, as much as 18 miles wide. The canyon in many places is actually sometimes a mile deep or more. It's pretty incredible. Yesterday, we actually went to a place called the Desert Watchtower, which is north of us. We have a 360-degree view for as far as you can see, and we couldn't actually see the western edge of the canyon or the northern and eastern edges. It's pretty incredible. How big do you think the canyon is? How long is it?
We have another poll question. So let's go ahead and get that pulled up. And we want you to take a guess in your class. How long do you think the Grand Canyon is? 65 miles, 198, 214, or 277 miles long? Go ahead and make your best guess.
Nice. And while we're doing that, it turns out that the Grand Canyon is the largest canyon in North America, but there are other canyons in the world that are actually even bigger. There's a canyon in Tibet right now, for example, that's on the order of 4 times as deep as the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon's about a mile deep. There's even a canyon underneath a gigantic glacier in Greenland, and that canyon is hundreds of miles long. It's something like 460 miles long underneath a mile of ice.
What a trip. That's wild. Okay, let's go ahead and close that poll question. What does our audience think? Okay, we've got a vote for 198 miles, a couple for 214, but the majority said it is 277 miles long. What's the answer, James?
Bingo, bango, bongo, 277. You got it. I love it. It's huge. It's monstrous. And imagine if you were driving a car, at highway speeds for that long. How long would that take you? It'd probably take you about 5 hours. That's a long drive.
It has taken us quite a while to drive in this area.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely incredible. One thing that I forgot to mention earlier when we talked about the water that carved the canyon is that there's actually another sort of secret source of water here. And we're going to show you a picture of some of that water in a moment. And that's from springs, because it turns out that many parts of the canyon have groundwater that's percolating through the rocks from rainfall and snow, and that comes out the sidewalls of the canyon. And this is an example of this is Vasey Spring that you just saw there. And those springs are really important because they actually provide a bunch of the water to the Colorado River at the bottom of the canyon. And they also provide incredible scientific information about the earth beneath our feet. And that's because as that water percolates through the rocks or even comes up from below, it carries with it chemical signatures, as well as sometimes particles from deep parts of the earth that we can otherwise not access. And we can study those as scientists and learn about how this ecosystem on the surface and on the subsurface operate. So that's amazing, but there are even more amazing things here in the Grand Canyon, including all the magnificent rocks behind me here. And so I want to just give you a very brief story of the Grand Canyon's geology and then open this up to questions, because I know you probably have a lot of questions for us here. So the Grand Canyon kind of has 3 basic sets of rocks, and those are visible behind me here. But we're going to show a cross-section of those right now on the screen as I talk about those, because I think of the Grand Canyon as like a giant volcanic sandwich, where at the bottom we have volcanic rocks as well as other types of rocks on the sandwich. And this isn't just like a sandwich like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's a sandwich with many layers. In the middle, there are layers that are tilted, like the purple one shown on the screen right here. And then above them, and there's a couple of volcanoes that are in that part of the sandwich too. And then above them are the horizontally layered rocks above them that we see all across the background behind me here that are on blue on the diagram you're seeing there. And even on the very top of those are, guess what? A couple more of our punky friends, volcanoes, that form volcanic frosting on the top of those and sometimes even spill over into the canyon.
Could I ask a quick question? How old exactly is this sandwich that we're talking about?
It's a 2 billion-year-old sandwich. And you know what? That sandwich is still forming today. So if we think about the rocks in the Grand Canyon, behind me here are some very dark-colored blob-like rocks out behind the point over there. And Kim is going to zoom in on those rocks down below where she's currently got the camera. And you can see some horizontally layered rocks. Okay, I'm going to sneak in here with my finger and just hold the camera, right? Just don't move the camera. Don't move the camera. Okay. I'm still moving my finger. Right here are those volcanic rocks that were basically formed on the bottom of the sea, nearly 2 billion years old. Those rocks include things like muds from the seafloor that have been squashed into a type of rock called schist, as well as rocks like basalt that were formed as volcanoes punctured the ocean floor, forming chains of islands like Hawaii. And as those seafloor muds and those volcanic islands collided with the North America as they were moving along the oceanic crust, skimming across the surface of the earth, they squished together and helped form the belly of the North American continent. These are a couple of examples in my hand of rocks just like those at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. This is an example of a rock called basalt, and you can see little holes in it where the bubbles of gases escaping from the lava popped out, or in some cases were trapped. And the rock on the left over here is a schist. It's actually quite a shiny rock, but it's basically made up of a bunch of seafloor muds and sands that got squished under high pressures and temperatures as the North American continent was colliding with that ancient seafloor. And when that happened, these rocks also got punctured by deep arteries of magma or underground lava that came up and cooled and formed a rock type known as granite. And in fact, this granite had lots of time to cool, and it formed large crystals. Is this better if I show this in the shadow so that you can see this rather than the sun? And so you can see pink and white and black crystals of quartz and feldspar and other minerals in here. And there are huge tendrils of these deep arteries of underground deep earth lava that came up and that are actually present right behind us here in what's known as the Granite Gorge, one of the deepest, narrowest parts of the Grand Canyon. And as those rocks continue to collide with North America, some of those cracks filled with granite that got squashed, got squeezed like a tube of toothpaste. And those cracks that were formerly straight became sinuous like a snake, like the ones that we can see right here in this rock, and became what's known as a metamorphic rock, a rock that had undergone metamorphosis, just like a caterpillar does into a butterfly. And those seafloor muds and ancient volcanic rocks and other sediments around them form the very floor of some of the hardest parts of the Grand Canyon. Well, about 500 or so million years after that, or in some cases even more, those rocks were eroded and beveled off as the seas came in and covered them up. And that formed that second sequence of rocks that we see in the Grand Canyon. And those rocks were mostly sedimentary rocks where particles were removed from land by rivers and streams, much like the ones that are happening today behind us here in the Grand Canyon, and also along beaches. And so as those rocks were deposited, they made horizontal layers one by one, including many rocks that have ripples in them like this, which formed as waves moved across a shallow bay or sea. And is this better in the sun versus the shade? And like this, back, okay. And so these are the types, that second set of rocks, sometimes known as the Grand Canyon Supergroup, which sounds kind of like a band, doesn't it? Well, if it is, it's full of rock stars.
We're starting a band. That's actually what we're doing. We're on
Nice.
right now.
So in addition, these rocks, they're part of the Grand Canyon Supergroup, include things that are made of limey muds that formed in bays and reef-like settings. And these rocks are layered as well. But what's neat about these is if you were to drop some acid on them, and in fact, I think I have an acid bottle right here, because every geologist carries a little bit of acid and a rock hammer and a hand lens wherever they go. So if you were to drop acid on these rocks, these would fizz because they're composed not of grains of quartz sand, but of bubbling or bubbleable particles of mineral calcite and other things like that. The same mineral that clams make their shells out of. And what's neat about this piece that I have right here is you know that it's not perfectly horizontally layered. There's actually kind of a dome-like bump in it right here. And that dome-like bump is a little reef formed by microscopic organisms like bacteria and slime. And these are the oldest examples of ancient life in the Grand Canyon from a rock unit known as the Bass Formation. deposited nearly 1 billion years ago. So after those horizontal rocks were deposited, they eventually were capped in places by volcanoes that form lava flows. We can actually see some of those back off in the distance there. And those rocks were tilted by faults that lifted up those rocks and um, tilted them away from where we are right now. And then eventually those rocks were beveled off and ground down as once again the seas came in and rivers overtopped them, and they cut grooves into those underlying rocks to help and created a flat plain. And that flat plain we can actually see right behind me here in the layer cake of the Grand Canyon. As we look out across the cliffs, you can see stripes of red and yellow and orange and sometimes even gray colored rocks that go as far as the eye can see. And those rocks are the last set of major sedimentary rocks in the canyon. And they're formed from sand, from mud, from lime, and from the shells and carcasses of ancient creatures that once lived in here over 500 to 250 million years ago. Well, the last part of that geologic sandwich comes on top of it. And one of those last parts is kind of like some volcanic frosting. And there are places in the canyon, and we can show you a picture of those right now, where lava flows have actually punctured, or volcanoes have punctured the top of the rims of the canyon, and the lava has flowed down on the top. So I'm wondering if Asa or Riley could show a picture of one of those lava flows from the western parts of the Grand Canyon, like from Vulcan's Throne, for example. So here you can see the gray cones on the upper right-hand corner of the screen with lava flowing down to the left. And there's a better picture that's in another photo that we might be able to show you on the screen, Asa or Riley, that shows those flows, and they're very dark. There we go. There's the river, and you can actually see the cones, the ancient lava cones at the top with the lava dribbling down to the river. And that lava actually dammed the river at times. And they produced rocks like this with incredible columns. So we can switch away from that photo. And these columns, this is called columnar basalt. You might have seen this in other national parks. And what's neat about this is these kinds of rocks tell us that the Earth's surface is still a very dynamic place, because some of these volcanoes just went off a mere thousands to tens of thousands of years ago. Well, that's enough for me. There's lots of geologic stories present in the rocks of the Grand Canyon. I've just highlighted a few of them, but I'd love to hear what your questions are and maybe explore a little bit of the Grand Canyon with you together while we're here at the South Rim.
Yeah, so at this point, we would love to go ahead and invite Tiffany Odell's crew from Byers to unmute yourself and join us on camera. We cannot wait to hear your questions. And my only request is, just because we're way out here, you're going to have to step up to the camera and speak nice and loud so we can hear that question.
Yeah, and if there's more than one of you in your classroom that has questions, maybe line up right next to the computer so that you can ask the questions right after one another. Oh, I see you're already doing that. Great.
Hi, what questions do you have?
What is the steepest part of the Grand Canyon?
What is the steepest part of the
Oh
Grand
my
Canyon?
gosh, the steepest part of the Grand Canyon. I don't know what the steepest part is. You know, there are some pretty darn steep parts right over here, actually, and right over there. And Kim can probably pan off where a rock unit known as the Kaibab Formation, or the Kaibab Limestone, forms huge cliffs that are perfectly vertical. In fact, the reason that this part of the canyon is held up is because that rock is so hard. And that rock is what we're actually standing on here. And it forms huge vertical cliffs because it has a lot of chert in it. Chert is basically a type of quartz that has microscopic crystalline structure, and that was formed from ancient creatures that lived in reefs nearly 270 million years ago. But there's other parts of the canyon that are also really steep that are at the very bottom down in the Granite Gorge. And that includes places like Kim was showing earlier off the point there, where there's very thick exposures of granite and gneiss that have been carved very narrowly and deeply by the Colorado River. So I would guess the steepest place is in one of those types of settings.
Very cool. That was a great question. What's another question from the classroom?
What would happen to the rock if the Grand Canyon just filled up with like water?
Ooh, I love this question.
Oh my gosh. So if the Grand Canyon filled up with water, first of all, I could dive right off this cliff and go swimming, right? But boy, if the Grand Canyon were to fill up with water, a couple of things would happen. One is the spring flow in some cases might reverse. There might actually be water percolating through all the cracks and fissures and faults in the canyon out into other outer layers. The other thing, though, is that we would no longer be able to come visit the Grand Canyon or appreciate its natural splendor or science because it would be underwater. We'd have to put a series of dams that would basically block most of the exit of the water from the Grand Canyon National Park. And you know, the other thing that happens is when you fill up a canyon with water, it doesn't just fill up with water. It actually fills up with all the sediment that's carried by the river. So in this case, the Colorado River, which we can show you a picture of, oftentimes is choked with sediment from all of the streams and sand and mud that gets carried from around surrounding areas in it. And so the dams actually fill up with a lake initially, but the bottom of that lake fills from the bottom upward with sediment. And that's actually something that's currently happening in Lake Mead and Lake Powell today, is that they're becoming filled from the bottom with all the sediments that the river carries. So not only would we bury the canyon in water, but we'd eventually would bury it back in sediment again.
That was a great question. Interesting to think about. What's another question from the classroom?
What makes the Grand Canyon so special? Why aren't there canyons everywhere?
Ooh.
I didn't quite get that question.
What makes the Grand Canyon so special? Why aren't there canyons everywhere?
Oh my gosh, boy, it turns out there are canyons in a lot of places in the West. But what makes it special? So the Grand Canyon is special to different people for different reasons. For me, as a geologist, the Grand Canyon is one of the greatest natural laboratories and recorders of Earth history on the planet. We have nearly 2 billion years of Earth history here. And because this place is really dry, the rocks aren't covered up by forests and grasses and soils and other things. And so we can actually see and read those rocks with great clarity. And many of the rocks here are actually in great condition too. But the Grand Canyon's special to biologists or to native peoples or to people who just like beautiful colors and views for lots of different reasons. So it's special to different people for different reasons. Why don't we have canyons everywhere? Well, it turns out there are a lot of canyons in the West, like Colorado has Black Canyon of the Gunnison. We have Glenwood Canyon. We have Royal Gorge, which are canyons that aren't quite as big as the Grand Canyon, but are narrow and deep and expose all sorts of different ecosystems and geologic terrain. One of the reasons you tend to get big canyons in the West is because we've had mountains lifting up the rocks and part of the continental plate upward. And when that happens, then there's an opportunity for rainfall or snow or other weathering factors to then cut into those rocks and make a path through them that then later becomes a canyon. So in fact, there are actually huge canyons all over the world, but mostly they're in places where the rocks have been uplifted, like where the continents have collided or there have been big episodes of uplift.
Great question. Let's go ahead and get another question from Byers Middle High School.
Have there been any recorded full fossils in the Grand Canyon?
Have there been any recorded
Fossils.
Oh my gosh.
I'm so glad you asked
Zillions
the
of
question.
cool fossils in the Grand Canyon. So I actually have some of those right here. And those fossils are found in many of those layered sedimentary rocks that we see right behind us over here. And one of the things that's pretty neat is some of the fossils are really easy to find. So this is an example here from the Bright Angel Shale, which is a 500 million year old sandstone and mudstone that was deposited. Is this tilted okay for the camera? That these record the burrows of worms and shrimp-like creatures that were cruising in the muds on that sea bottom in a bay, much like we might see off the coast of a tropical setting today. And so these are, for geologists, the fossils are clues to ancient Earth history. And so minerals are clues, fossils are clues, chemistry is clues. structures formed in the rock, like ripples are clues. And so we take this information and put it together to understand what the environments were like in deep time and how they changed. And in fact, in these rocks in between these mudstones are sometimes some other fossils that are pretty cool, like these ones here. And so, for example, this is a mudstone right here, or a shale, and it's kind of a layered rock, and you can see the layers in it deposited at the bottom of the sea. And it's kind of a boring looking rock, that is, until you crack it open. And so if you take a hammer like this and you crack open one of these rocks, it will usually split where there's something different inside it. And in this case, what's different, and is it better if I put this in the sun like it currently is at an angle? You have what looks like an ancient beetle. And this is sometimes nicknamed a cockroach of the sea. This is a trilobite. It's an arthropod kind of related to crabs and shrimp and beetles today. And these things cruised the seas for nearly 200 million years, were some of the most dominant creatures that cruised around the seas. And we've got their fossils in these rocks, and we use them to help us tell time and environments. So indeed, in those layered rocks, there are lots of clues just like these to ancient Earth history.
That was a fantastic question. We even got to see some specimens because of it. Let's go ahead and get one last question from buyers before we turn to our second on-camera school. Hi there.
Hi. What's your favorite part of the Grand Canyon?
Favorite part of the Grand Canyon?
Oh my gosh, my favorite part of the question. That
That's
is
a
a
hard one.
tough one
That's
to
like the hardest
answer.
one.
Oh my gosh. My favorite part of the Grand Canyon. Oh boy, that's a tough one. It might be Pumpkin Springs. Pumpkin Springs is a beautiful spring that comes out on the south side of the river. And the springs I mentioned that come out of the canyon, there's beautiful geology around there, but it's really young geology. And so those springs are carrying dissolved materials. And oftentimes they dissolve the limestones and the dolostones that occur in the upper parts of the canyon. And so when the water comes out and it is suddenly at, let's say, room temperature and a different pressure, that stuff precipitates out and grows, kind of like rock candy. And you form a rock known as travertine and other things like that. And Pumpkin Springs is one that looks like a pumpkin, and it's right along the river. It's beautiful. There are places nearby that you can swim. And I feel like it's one of my favorite places because it's both beautiful, it looks like art, and it has a really cool geology story that's still going on today, because as that spring feeds Pumpkin Springs and many of the structures around it, it's still growing and evolving into the next beautiful form that someone's going to see 100 years or 1,000 years from now.
Wow.
It's geology in action.
Yeah, I want to see Pumpkin Springs now too. I have to also say, James has not only seen the Grand Canyon before this trip, he's seen it from down in the bottom because he's actually gotten to raft through the Grand Canyon, which is something that not a lot of people get to do. I'm extremely envious. But I encourage maybe all of you to try and find a way to do it someday in the future because it sounds like a blast.
Yeah, or hiking. Lots of people hike into the canyon and camp, or they might hike along the rim to watch it from different vantage points. So
that was a great question. At this point, I would like to go ahead and invite our second group to join us on camera and unmute. That looks like it's Loch Wooey Elementary. I'm sorry if I pronounced your school name wrong, but go ahead and if you would like to bring yourself on camera, we cannot wait to hear your questions for James as well.
All right.
In the meantime, James. Oh, it looks like they're on. Okay, cool. Hi there.
Hello.
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 What are the types of rocks on the Grand Canyon? Skibbity toilet house like
Types of rocks in the Grand Canyon.
what types of rocks? Well, we've got all types of rocks in the Grand Canyon, of course. Well, there are three basic types of rocks. The first type of rock, which I showed you an example of before, is known as an igneous rock. And an igneous rock is one like these that cools from either underground lava, which we call magma, like this granite here, or that cools from lava that comes out on the surface, like this basalt here. So those are called igneous rocks, igneous. The second kind of rock that we have here is broad category rock, are rocks known as metamorphic rocks. And those are rocks that have been metamorphosed from one type into another. And they might include things like this schist up here in my upper hand, or this gneiss down in my lower hand here. So rocks that have gotten squished from one state and the minerals have rearranged or recrystallized into another. So that's metamorphic rocks. And then the last types of rocks are some of the ones that I showed you that had fossils in them, right? Or that had structures in them, like these ripple marks from this ancient sandstone. Or even some examples like this one here. This is a rock that's made up of tiny particles of sand. And I'm going to pivot this into the sunlight like this, maybe. And if we zoom in on this, we can see that not only are there horizontal layers of that you can peel off, but there are tiny little circles on here that are actually the droplets of raindrops that fell on this rock nearly 275 million years ago. So sedimentary rocks are the last major type. And I once had a geology professor that called them ignorant, metaphorical, and sedentary rocks, just to make them easier to remember. So those are the three broad categories of rock types. The Grand Canyon has all of them. And then within those broad categories, there's lots of different sub-example types of rocks. And maybe you'll be lucky enough to go explore some of these rock types on your own, maybe in your own backyard, or perhaps at the Grand Canyon someday.
Could I pose a quick question? Which of these kinds of rocks are we most likely to find fossils in? So if someone was to look for fossils, what kind of rock should they be looking for?
I kind of wish we had a poll for that question,
I know.
but instead, what do you think?
Yeah, so maybe in the chat, if you've got access, which of these three kinds of rocks do you think we typically find dinosaurs or track marks or just anything else like that trilobite? Where do you think we find rocks, or fossils in these three kinds of rocks? So you can go ahead and post your answer in the chat and we'll be able to see it.
Oh, it looks like you got it right on. Sedimentary rocks is the answer.
Sedimentary,
Because
nice.
sedimentary rocks, for the most part, are formed by ancient surface earth environments, right? Whether they be surface of land like we're standing right now, or maybe the surface of the earth, but underwater or in the water. And that's where most organisms live on the planet today.
Very cool. I love that.
Although there are a couple of examples of fossils that are in volcanic rocks too, like places where elephants have been trapped by a lava flow and actually fossilized, and you get a volcanic rock surrounding the skeleton of the elephant. Or there are places where, for example, if you think about Pompeii, which is a human example, where creatures have been buried in volcanic ash. And we actually have a great example of one of those in Colorado, down near Colorado Springs. So fossils can occur in igneous rocks, but they're mostly, and in metamorphic rocks, but they're mostly in sedimentary rocks.
Very cool. Cool. All right, let's go ahead and get another question from Lockbury. What would you like to know? Hi there.
Is there active volcanoes in the Grand Canyon today?
Ooh.
Are there active volcanoes in the Grand Canyon today? Alas, there are not.
Is that alas? I might be worried about it.
Yeah, well, thankfully, we're not going to get buried by a lava flow, but there have been volcanic events happen in relatively, geologically speaking, recent time, on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago. And in fact, where we live in Colorado, the youngest volcano is only 4,000 or so years old, and native peoples actually watched it explode and dam one of our local rivers, the Eagle River and the Colorado River, up in the mountains in the Rockies. So there are places where they're not active today, but they have been active within human inhabitation of this region.
Yeah, in case you didn't know, Colorado has Sarah, and that is a volcano.
Sure
So
is.
there are a lot of volcanoes across the country and obviously around the world. So it's pretty exciting. What's another question from the classroom?
And actually, one of the things that Kim's pointing out right now, if she just pans a little bit up, higher up from where she's panning right now, that layer right there, that dark layer right in the middle of the screen, which I'm now going to try to put my hand on, is actually an example of some ancient lava flows. Oh, I don't know if I can get my hand quite over there, but right in here, there are actually some dark layers that are actually ancient lava flows that are on the order of 1 billion years old. So volcanoes have been going off since the Earth was created, and they're still going off today.
Pretty cool. Geology is amazing.
Yeah.
All right, what's another question from Lochbuie? Hi
There
there.
you go.
Hi, my name is Tegan and my little friend Orchid. I want to know if there's any special, like unique animals that use its geology in the Grand Canyon.
Ooh,
Are there unique animals that use the geology of the Grand Canyon?
that's a cool question.
Boy, I imagine so. I don't know what those animals are, though. I know, for example, that the Grand Canyon has a unique rattlesnake. I believe it's called the pink rattler or something like that. And I don't know if it's here because of the climate or the geology. I guess we'll have to ask the snakes. But I would imagine that there are plenty of other creatures here that leverage the unique geology of this place to their advantage. So maybe we'll do a scientist in action with a biologist and ask them, or ask a park ranger.
I would love that. Yeah, we have already seen, it's funny, you can't see it, it's off camera. There's a little bird who is looking for snacks just over here too as we speak. There are a ton of animals in the Grand Canyon. James just highlighted one endemic species, which means it's only found here in the Grand Canyon. And I'm sure they are so finely adapted to survive in this area that there is no way they cannot use the geology to their advantage. There's not a lot of water out here and it gets pretty hot. So
Yep.
there have to be some very clever animals. So that was a really cool question. Thank you, Tegan. All right, let's go ahead and get another question from the classroom.
Hi, what changes the color of the rocks?
What
A cool
changes the
question.
color of the rocks? The answer is it depends. So a lot of rocks that you see, like the striped rocks in the background, are either red or orange or brown or white or tan or even gray. And those colors oftentimes come from the minerals in those rocks. So for example, here's a rock that I showed you earlier, and this is kind of a tan rock right here. And is it better if I put this in the sun like this? And this is that rock with raindrop imprints in it. So this is a tan colored rock. It's got layers, but it's made up of tiny quartz grains. And those quartz grains are typically white or ivory colored or light gray. And so they make this rock kind of a lightish colored rock. But one of the things, other rocks might have particles in them that are darker, that are gray or brown or red. But one thing that oftentimes happens is that water percolates through rocks, and that water is carrying oxygen with it. And so if there are any minerals in the rock that have any iron in them or manganese or things like that, you might actually start to get some staining. And we can actually see a little bit of that on the rock right here. This looks like a little rust spot. And that's a place where most likely there was a little bit of iron in the mineral there or something of that ilk. And as water percolated through the rock, the oxygen in a way started to rust that mineral or alter it to make it more orange or brown in color. And so sometimes rocks have their color because of their primary minerals that grew in them. Like for example, this granite, has kind of a salt and pepper texture to it or color. I think this one might be better in the shade. Yes, maybe. Has a salt and pepper texture to it. And that's because it has black colored minerals and white colored minerals and pink colored minerals in it. But other rocks, their color comes from alteration of their primary minerals and grains by groundwater percolating through it.
Great question.
And red is orange are really common colors in the southwestern US because there's a lot of rocks that have a lot of iron in them and other metal-bearing minerals that can get, if you will, rusted or oxidized or altered by groundwater percolating through them.
Cool. That was a great question. Thank you for asking that. Let's get one last question from the classroom. What would you like to ask James?
How did those large tower parts form in the Grand Canyon?
How did the large tower kind of formations form?
Oh, the large tower things. Whoa, those are really cool. In fact, I just hiked one of them for the first time late last year. Let's see if we can get one of them on camera. There might be some out there. I see two of those towers out there. Those butte-like structures that kind of come up like a cone are usually formed because they have some kind of a resistant rock at the top of them. And that resistant rock, okay, I'm now going to try to point in to where Kim, I probably won't be able to reach point where Kim is at, but that resistant rock, which is light colored in this photo, and I'm going to bring my hand down really slowly, and then I'm going to move it over right there. That light colored rock is actually full of the mineral chert. And chert is basically like quartz or glass. It's a very hard mineral, and it came from ancient creatures that lived in reef-like settings in those rocks. And so that rock is much harder than the red striped rocks underneath it that are at the bottom of your screen right now. And so what happens is rain and wind and snow and the scratches of mice and gravity and other plant roots and other things break down the rocks and dissolve them into particles or into chemical materials that then work their way down the hill slope. If they're capped by a harder piece of rock, oftentimes that will stick up. And it's kind of like a geologic shield that's preventing the rest of the rocks underneath it from eroding, because it has a really strong shield of, in this case, cherty rock up above. And that's that white layer that you see there. So a lot of the pinnacles and buttes in the canyon, and in fact, the rims are made up of a really durable rock that helps in some ways form those really cool structures.
Cool.
Meanwhile, everything around them gets eroded.
And I want to, this is not in the Grand Canyon, but I want to give James a quick shout out because actually in Colorado, there's a very similar structure that people have been confused by for a long time. Why is it still standing? And it turns out it's full of opal. Is that
Yeah,
like
so
that gemstone?
Exactly. So in Colorado, right near Denver, kind of between Denver and Colorado Springs, where we live, there's a rock known as Castle Rock, and it looks like a castle, and it looks like some of the things behind us here. And that rock is made up of something called a conglomerate, which is lots of small particles of gravel and sand that have been kind of glued together. And normally that rock that sits on top of the buttes breaks down very easily and dissolves in rainwater over the scale of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of years. But in this case in Colorado, that conglomerate rock that sits on top of Castle Rock and a lot of the mesas, mesa means table-like mountains near southern Denver, is sticking up like a castle. And the reason it's sticking up is it's actually cemented together or glued together with chalcedony or opal, which is very much like chert. It's like glass. It is harder than concrete, and it helps cement that rock together. And normally that rock would just crumble into blah. But so around you, you might even have some buttes that are being held up by really resistant rocks as well.
Very cool. All right, so there's one question I do want to kind of highlight. It's like two questions, but it's from the chat, and it's going to be our last one because we're kind of running out of time.
All righty.
But one is, how can we age these things? How do we know how old they are? And then also two, when we're in the field and we're, finding specimens, how do we keep from damaging the Grand Canyon? What's kind of the process for protecting that?
Boy, two awesome questions. So one question is, how do we date rocks? And it turns out one of the ways we can date rocks is using relative dating. So I showed you that cross section before, at the very beginning, which maybe Asa can pull up, that showed a cross section of the Grand Canyon. But the rocks in general on the bottom that have been cross-cut by rocks overlying it, the ones on the bottom are older. And then the ones that are above those that cross-cut them and erode into them, like the blue layer, are younger than the purple layer in this case. So in this case, in this diagram, the first rocks to form were the brown ones. The second ones were the purple ones, which are tilted, which were then eroded. And then the horizontal ones were formed on top of those. And because kind of like a deck of cards or a book of strata, the lowest horizontal ones are oftentimes the oldest, and the youngest ones are the ones that were deposited on top. And in this case, the rocks formed by the volcano that then flowed into the canyon and covered up those sedimentary rocks is the youngest one there. So that's one way to date rocks. The other way is that rocks have crystals in them, whether they're sedimentary rocks, whether they're igneous rocks, or whether they're metamorphic rocks. And those crystals are like time capsules from deep time, because oftentimes there are crystals like zircon or other minerals, apatite, that have essentially little radioactive clocks in them. And we can measure the composition of those crystals, and using experiments in the lab, count, kind of like an hourglass, the grains of sand that go from the top to the bottom. Those crystals record the amount of change in the elements in those crystals just like an hourglass records the change in the amount of sand from the top to the bottom of the hourglass. And by counting those differences in the composition of those minerals, we can come up with an actual number for the age of the rock, like 1.805 billion years old, or 10,000 years old, or the like. And so geologists use the combination of that sequential layering of the rocks and their cross-cutting relationships together with the ability to date minerals in the rocks to kind of figure out how things and when things happen in deep time. So that's that question. The other question I feel like Kate and I could both answer, and that is, there's a common expression, which is, leave only footprints or something like that. What is and take only memories? And so one of the ways we can preserve places like this is by taking care of it, right? The Grand Canyon is not a garbage can, and it is not a place that you're actually allowed to go collect samples from unless you have a special permit. And so by doing that, by caring for it, by appreciating it, by supporting it, places like this, we can preserve them for the next generation of visitors who might want to appreciate these natural wonders themselves.
Absolutely. There are some really amazing trail systems that we're not having the chance to hike today while we're visiting because we're chatting with you, which is amazing. But there's so many cool ways to see this canyon. And like James was saying, it's just really about being conscientious of where you're leaving those footprints and making sure that you're leaving specimens and things behind so that other visitors can see them too. It's pretty neat. So on that note, we are unfortunately all out of time. This has been so fun. I've learned a million new things. I have a million more questions, and I just cannot wait to hear maybe more as the day continues. So a couple of people I want to thank. Obviously, we have Riley, Asa, and Kim, who y'all can't see because they're behind the camera and in the studio making today's program happen. Thank you all our friends behind or on camera who asked questions as well as put them in the chat. Thank you, of course, James, for giving us this information. This has been so fun. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you will come back next month. We'll be doing another field visit. So we cannot wait to see you next time. This has been so fun. Keep exploring, and we will talk to you later.
Have a great day. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.